Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Implement a Data-Centric Audit and Protection Strategy. I'm Stephanie DiPaolo from Sherpa Software, coming to you from our Pittsburgh office. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few items with you first. First, audio is available by dialing the number provided. If you're having any issues, please let us know through the chat panel. If you have any questions, you may enter them during the Q&A at the end. And at the conclusion of the webinar, there will be a few survey questions about your webinar experience. Your participation in the survey will be greatly appreciated. I have with me today Rick Wilson, VP of Solutions and Strategy at Sherpa Software. Rick works directly with the CEO and Director of Development to establish the organization's strategic direction. He has completed information governance trainings and also works closely with clients to shape the roadmap for Altitude, Sherpa's data governance and e-discovery SaaS platform. Previously, Rick was a solutions architect working closely with sales and formulating solutions to address each client's unique business and technical needs. Also, Danny Murphy, the VP of Technical Delivery at Lepide. Danny brings over 10 years experience in the IT industry. With award-winning success in leading global pre-sales and support teams, coupled with his knowledge and enthusiasm for IT security solutions, he is with Lepide to ensure they deliver market-leading products and support to their extensively growing customer base. All right, let's quickly cover the agenda items for today. I'll be providing a brief background of Sherpa Software and Lepide as joint solution providers. Then we'll discuss the different approaches to securing data within your organization and how to define an insider threat. You'll learn about familiar industry term DCAP before we introduce you to some of our options on implementing a data-centric approach. There's been time allotted at the end for additional Q&A as needed. Now let's go over some Sherpa Software stats. Sherpa is the cost-effective solution for data governance, privacy, and compliance, and e-discovery business needs. Starting in September 2000 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Sherpa has helped more than 3,500 organizations worldwide with award-winning software services and support. Now for Lepide. Lepide was founded and incorporated in 2004 and employs over 130 people across the globe with offices in London, Austin, and New Delhi. Lepide has thousands of reputable customers worldwide, including Deloitte, GE Healthcare, and more. Okay, and we are going to get started with our first of 3 poll questions. So we'll go ahead and launch that now and give you a few minutes to submit your answers. So go ahead and do that, and then we'll close and share the results soon. Okay, a couple more minutes here. Okay, we'll close that and share the results. So it looks like 71% said yes, that the current security focus includes examining the data. Very good. We'll go ahead and hide this question, return to the slides. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Danny.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Steph. Could you just give me control of the slides? I'll just move them on a little bit. That would be really good.
Sure, yep.
That's good.
Okay, do you have access?
I think so. Let me just check. Let's have a look here. Tell you what, it doesn't seem to be working. That's all right. Do you want to just move it on one anyway? So,
Sure.
yeah, I mean, the stats that we just looked at were quite interesting. I think, and it's really good to see that 75% of the audience are examining their data. So well done. I mean, what we generally tend to find, Rick, and I'm kind of asking you, when we look at a typical approach within an organization, the way that they actually secure their data, we generally still see more often than not that they are using old security strategies and approaches that focus heavily on protecting from the outside in. And this is a kind of an older way of thinking, or a traditional way of thinking. And I mean, ultimately what we're talking about here is starting with the perimeter type security first. Of course, I believe that this is important, and I'm not saying that it should be neglected. And I think it's imperative that adequate spending is allocated to network security. I mean, we know that today approximately 90% of an organization's IT security budget is spent on protecting against external threats, which only really leaves 10% left to spend on protecting against insider threats. So I believe this has become a little more proportionate. I've certainly seen indications of this over the past 12 months, but I still don't really believe it's enough. I mean, what do you think, Rick?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Danny. It's really encouraging to see those kinds of poll results because a lot of the prospects we're talking to today are just starting to introduce some kind of a focus on data into their security approach. They've spent all this resource, time, money, staff, and so forth, hardening infrastructure, as you said, firewalls, port monitoring tools, things like that. But often they have not quite yet addressed the risks associated with exposing this data or securing it, locking it down, or even understanding who has access to it.
Mm, mm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And when we Steph, could you just move on the slides one as well? Oh, we've got a poll question in here. So before we go into looking at these threats, let's run this next poll question.
Yes, okay. The next one, let's go ahead and launch that now. What do you perceive to be your biggest risks? Data breaches, network intrusions, insider threats, ransomware, all of the above. So if you could just take a couple seconds here to cast your vote, and then we will share those responses. Okay, let's go ahead and close those out and share. Looks like 71% all of the above.
All of the above. Interesting results. So, and then we can see that the second highest there was, of course, data breaches. I'm not sure if that's because it's become more highly publicized or if we're getting better awareness and better education for our end users around internal threats. And when we talk about internal or insider threats, what we're really kind of talking about is in some cases perceived external attacks, but what they're actually doing is they're exploiting insider vulnerabilities, essentially known as people hacking. They're using tried, tested, and thoroughly successful hacking techniques such as spear phishing or social engineering are still widely adopted and very effective and becoming even more sophisticated. Let me move on one more. I mean, I think there are many different types of insider threats to take into consideration. Here is kind of just a few that I can think of. So we're looking at kind of opportunity, an employee or someone that's got access to data inside the network looking to steal data for self-gain, or just generally discovering what they can actually get access to. So not necessarily malicious, maybe not premeditated, just again, just looking for opportunity. Then we look at revenge, maybe a disgruntled employee who feels a type of injustice has been done, may actively seek to damage the business in some way through data theft or opening access to data and the surrounding systems, maybe actually creating some kind of planning for a premeditated attack in the future. And then data theft for reimbursement. So maybe the employee has been offered a reward to provide confidential information to an outsider, or even in extreme cases being held to ransom to provide company data externally. Protecting public interest, so an employee that doesn't agree with an organization's policies, maybe taking it upon themselves to share this information publicly, could be seen as doing the public some kind of justice, the kind of Edward Snowden type of breach. Or maybe the employee is looking at starting a competing business in the future and decides to essentially just steal information, intellectual property, customer databases, or whatever they believe they need to successfully get a competing organization off the ground. And then finally, just lack of education. So going back to that kind of people hacking, we really need to be educating our organizations. This isn't just an IT department problem. This is organizational wide across all departments. So as I said before, social engineering and spearphishing as hacking techniques are still widely used, and they are sophisticated, but again, they're just engineering and taking advantage and manipulating people's behavior to have them participate in an attack. So they're completely unaware. So, you know, it's an external threat exploiting internal vulnerabilities. And I think that, you know, what we really need to do, and Rick, I'm going to kind of pass it over to you here to start talking about this, is really putting data at the center of our security strategy, actually starting with the data first. So, I mean, Rick, do you want to elaborate a little bit more on what a data-centric audit and protection strategy is?
Yeah, absolutely, Danny.
Yeah, cool.
And as you called out, you know, these insider threats are real. These aren't situations that our prospects, and I'm sure yours, are dealing with every day, and you don't have to look much further than the news to find out. The stakes are getting higher in this whole arena because emerging policies like the California Consumer Protection Act here in the States, of course GDPR in the EU, and a number of other pending privacy litigations are really putting the responsibility for these kinds of breaches that can happen based on insider threats or just malicious intent squarely on the shoulders of the enterprises that are being breached. So makes the stakes very high. And with that in mind, then let's talk a little bit about what the elements of a DCAP strategy are. And in fact, what is a DCAP strategy? So as you all probably know, Data-Centric Audit and Protection is what the acronym stands for. And it's a strategy for protecting your organization's data privacy, but it emphasizes security of the data itself rather than the security of your networks, your hardware, and your software. One of the main benefits of a DCAP strategy is that the data security can be applied to specific pieces of data that need to be protected. So it's very easy to scale this across the enterprise. And many of you are dealing with that with disparate workforces, people in different locations, information workers who have access to this data, but maybe are not necessarily directly on the corporate network and much more difficult for you to control. The chart that you're looking at on the screen lays out sort of the 4 pillars, if you will, or processes that are typically associated with a DCAP strategy. And I think this was initially formulated by Gartner, as a matter of fact.
That's correct. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And the processes include the ability to know where your sensitive data is stored. We're certainly going to talk about that a little bit more. How that data is being managed within a business context. Defending your data against unauthorized access or usage. And I know Danny is certainly going to touch on that in a few moments. And then data monitoring and auditing to really uncover deviations from normal behavior that might indicate some sort of malicious intent is going on with the data. Danny, anything you'd like to add there from my little quick DCAP overview?
No. I think that's absolutely. I think that's spot on. As you kind of mentioned, with regards to this is what Gartner define as a DCAP strategy. Now, we're not saying that there's a single solution that can cover this by any means, and we're not saying that this is the entire scope of a DCAP strategy. But as a minimum, this is what Gartner essentially defined. So you have to have security controls in place to identify where your most critical data is, so through discovery and classification. We then have to understand who's got access to it and if those access levels are appropriate, understand how users are interacting with the data and the surrounding systems as well, and if any of that activity is unusual, we're kind of going into user behavior and anomaly detection. And then finally, understanding any changes that may weaken the systems that control access to the data. So, for example, Active Directory security group modifications is also something that we should certainly be monitoring. And I think, you know, as we kind of move in to the next part of this this presentation today, what we're really going to try and do is to demonstrate how, at this kind of fundamental level, how we can start with data first between Sherpa and Lepide.
Okay, that brings us to poll question number 3, our final poll question. So we'll go ahead and share that here. Okay, have you deployed any elements of a DCAP strategy? Let's take a couple seconds here and fill this in. few more seconds and we'll go ahead and close this out and share those results. So it looks like 43% say permissions and privileges, and 43% no, we do not have any deployed. So go ahead and hide those and then kick it back to you guys.
Cool. Interesting stats there.
Thanks, Steph. Yeah, absolutely, Danny. Not what I had expected to see at all. So, folks, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about how our two organizations came together from an approach of giving you some sort of a DCAP implementation plan. From a Sherpa point of view, we're going to talk about that sort of data discovery and classification capability. What's out there? Who has it? How do I find it? And then how do I sort of organize it for ongoing management? And then Danny, would you like to talk about what you're going to show from the Lepide point of view?
Yeah, essentially, what we're going to do after we've looked at Sherpa is understand who's got access to it, and again, really going back to that DCAP side, I think, Rick.
Yep.
Once we've done the discovery and classification, we've identified our most critical files and what's sensitive and what's not, and what we can actually do with that. I think the next piece really is to understand who's got access to it. Are those access levels appropriate? How are users using those access rights? How are they interacting with the data? I think that really is what I want to go through today.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes perfect sense. So let's talk a little bit about Sherpa's platform. Our tool is called Altitude. And Altitude is designed to allow you to be able to search for content in your environment, find that information, be able to put some context around it from a classification point of view so that you continue to manage it. And then as we talked to Lepide initially, and we sort of realized that we've got such a synergy between the two companies can provide to you, we can give you that eyeball into the data that's out in your environment and then provide that information to them now that we know what sensitive data we have, who has the access controls and so forth. So we're going to start by logging into an Altitude session here to give you a little overview of how that might work in our environment. You'll notice up at the top of the administrative dashboard here in the Altitude environment, there's a module for data governance. That's where we would define the policies that are going to help us identify sensitive content. What is sensitive content for you? Is it things that contain personal information, names, addresses, date of birth, that sort of thing? Is it social security numbers or some other identifier that might be appropriate to the country that you live in? Is it a credit card type piece of data? We deal with customers in a lot of vertical markets, and all of them have some specific spin around what personal information is in them. So data governance allows us to craft the rules that are going to enforce those policies. There's also a classification component that'll let you mark or tag those items once they're identified so you can manage them on an ongoing basis. All of this is delivered through a set of software components that get installed internally in a customer environment. So you'll notice down here at the bottom left-hand side of the console, this talks about the infrastructure that powers all of that functionality that I just talked about. Principally, there's this idea of a connector, which is basically an agent-based architecture. The reason that's important is because it helps you get out to endpoints that you might not otherwise be able to reach. It's typically very easy to reach the network servers, maybe your network file shares, your email systems internally. However, it can be much more difficult to get to employee devices, especially if those employees are scattered in various physical locations. Perhaps they're not on the corporate network in on a consistent amount of time, so you don't know what's on their laptop, that sort of thing. So these connectors can be deployed to a variety of locations, like a Windows machine that's out in the field, that give you visibility to that machine. That then can power your data governance initiative into that environment. In the Altitude model, that data governance process begins with defining what we call a workflow. And a workflow allows you to craft the rules that identify what sensitive content is to you. As I mentioned earlier, that sort of definition varies from customer to customer. So these workflows are flexible. You can create them. We can train our customers how to create them. They can retain us to create them for them. But in this example, you can see the workflow is looking for information that's relevant to a US Social Security number, some GDPR related terms, and credit cards. That was important to this customer. So the workflow allows us to define that kind of information. What are we looking for? And we can base that on words, phrases, expressions, patterns. There's a number of criteria that can go into answering that question. What is a Social Security number? What is a credit card or some other set of personal data? Once you've defined this workflow process, then you can attach that to a policy. You can see here I created a policy for my sensitive data inventory, and that's where we would tell Altitude to run that set of rules that we just created on specific endpoints, these network file shares, these user machines, these corporate resources, that sort of thing. When that process occurs, and that can be run repetitively on an automatic scheduled basis, when that process occurs, then it generates typically some kind of a data audit report. And you can see my last one was created on the 9th of August. And I get an example of all the areas that were scanned. Now this happened to be run against a specific workstation. So it was scanning a user device out in the field, looking for various criteria. And in the report columns here, you can see the name of the file, where it was located on the device. Now that information is still resonant on that machine where we located it. All we've done is pull back some metadata to allow you to see where it was located and perhaps if that information is relevant. So for example, if I open up this little text preview, I can see this document in fact looked like some kind of an order document stored on that laptop that did have some credit card information that might be important. A couple of things happen now that you've got this sort of data inventory, if you will, that's available to you. One thing that can be done is you can mark the items that are sensitive with this little label indicator. And you can see that little blue tag now is applied to that item. That tag then can be used in a subsequent process to provide some kind of enforcement on the content, copy it, move it, perhaps delete it. The other thing that we can do with this list then is export it to a CSV file. That can happen automatically. This could be delivered to you via email when the report runs, something along those lines. That then could become the basis for moving into your Lepide solution and saying, now that I've identified the fact that this file has a Social Security number, who has access to it and why do they have access to it and should they have access to it? And Danny will show you how to answer some of those questions. The second piece of what Altitude can do with regards to a DCAP strategy then is allow you to apply some classification information to your sensitive content. So you can create different sorts of labels for what classification categories are important in your environment. You can see here I created historical business records. I've got public, private, confidential. So I've got 4 different categories that are available. And I could certainly add additional categories if necessary by just adding a new category. Much like what I talked about with data governance then, you could create a workflow process to analyze your information, run that in a policy to label different files based on the fact that they have a credit card or a Social Security number or whatever sensitive data element is important to you. Create a labeled set of content with that particular tag associated with it. Let me clear this so you can see the whole list. And now you've got an inventory of classified information. So maybe that allows you to answer the question, what was on this workstation that was classified as confidential if that workstation is lost, destroyed, stolen, that sort of thing. You can also then use those classification tags to apply some future retention. I want to apply a retention policy that says any historical business record that's more than 7 years old is going to be automatically deleted. So Altitude can help you wrap up the beginning part of that sort of DCAP strategy to help identify and manage your information moving forward. And now I'll turn it back over to Danny, and we can talk about how you can take that information, find out who has access to it.
Great. All right, thanks, Rick. Yeah, that was really, really interesting. So I'm just going to make myself the presenter then and show my screen. There we go. Hopefully, all you guys should be able to see that now. So yeah, so really, you know, what we're talking about here is once we've gone through the process of identifying where our most critical files are, what those files actually contain. using Sherpa, the next step is really to understand, who's got access to it. So what we're looking at on the screen here is the current version of our solution, our data security platform, Lepide Auditor. And I'm going to jump to the permissions and privileges section within the solution. So yeah, essentially understanding who's got access to these critical files. So what I'm looking at here is a particular directory on one of my file shares on my file server. And if you look over to the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you can see a list of the objects that are in this particular folder. So we can see files that contain credit card numbers, social security numbers, Australian bank account numbers, for example, and all of this has been picked up through data discovery and classification. We've given the files an associated risk level as well, so depending on what the content of the actual files will determine how high a risk the file is, depending on who's got access to it. And then what we're looking at to the left of that section is a list of all of the users and their effective permissions. So for example, here we can see, if we look at Jill, she's got an effective permission of full control, and you can see that all of the ticks are highlighted blue. What this essentially means that the granular permissions that she has assigned through the effective permission full control, she's actually using. So she's creating files, modifying files, changing permissions, deleting files, essentially using all of those granular permissions. But if we look at the users from James downwards, so James, Sharon, Shelley, Billy, Jason, Tom, and so on, you can see that all of the ticks are red. So they've all got an effective permission of full control, but they're not actually doing anything within that directory. They're not actually accessing this data at all. So what we're really talking about here is using this visibility to adopt what we call a least privilege model. So essentially, within the last 360 days, you can see in this filter at the top here, none of these users have interacted with this data whatsoever. So they really need access. By adopting this least privilege model and having this visibility, we can confidently revoke the privileges for these users. So essentially, what we're saying here is only giving access to the users who actually need access. Again, if we want to understand how they're getting those permissions, this is often quite a challenge for organizations. Certainly from my own perspective, when I used to work as a systems administrator and essentially around file storage systems, if I had to grant or revoke privileges around data, and it was in like a kind of a larger organization where maybe the Active Directory security group structure had become unorganized, it became very difficult to manage and really understand if I'd had 100% successfully revoked or granted access to a specific data set. So what we're talking about here is permissions analysis. If we take the same directory and analyze those permissions on this particular directory, you can see from this view, we've got a list of users that have got access to this data. If I pick a specific user, from here I can see the effective permission is, again, full control. And what this view is going to help me to determine is where are they getting those permissions from. So directly applied, indirectly applied through security group membership. I can go in from this section and actually view those security groups as well. So I can explore the security groups from within Lepide. And if we have a look at this particular section now, I can see this security group. Within here, I can see a nested security group. And I can see that the user that I am investigating, Dave, is a member of this security group and a member of the nested security group. So in order for me to revoke Dave's permissions successfully and completely, I'd have to remove him from this security group, and also remove the directly applied permissions as well, therefore ensuring that Dave no longer has access to this data. It's also important to get a good understanding of how users are interacting with the data as well, and the surrounding systems. So that's understanding permissions and excessive permissions. If we go to user and entity behavioral analysis, I've opened up one of these predefined reports within Lepide Auditor, and this is all modifications within a file server. And what we've done here is we've normalized the data, as we say, to give us readable and understandable information. So what we're looking at here is how the users are interacting with the data over a specific period of time. And because we structured the data in such a way that you can actually make sense of it, it's very, very easy to filter this information. So for example, if I want a list of any files that were copied that may contain, say, credit card numbers from a specific location and by a specific user, I can easily find that information out. Once we've been able to understand and identify where our most critical data is, what I can also do is create contextual alerts around this data as well. So for example, we can also identify open shares within an organization. So I may want to create immediately contextual alerts around if any of this sensitive information is copied into an open share, therefore exposing it to almost everyone within the organization. So I can create contextual alerts around that data as well. And this is also going to help us to identify potential data breaches, help us to identify maybe potential ransomware attacks if there are unusual processes that are consistently or frequently renaming files or failing to access files is typical behavior of a traditional ransomware attack as well. So we can use all of these particular security controls around our data to really start securing with the data first. And then talking about the systems that surround the data as well, if we go back to the insider threat that we were talking about earlier, in this kind of example that we're looking at here, we're looking at modifications and interactions, not just around the data. So we can see a bunch of data that was accessed by a specific user, a load of network documentation in this example. But then we can see some unusual behavior around changes being made through Active Directory and group policy as well in this example. So here we can see an external contractor account was enabled. We can also see that this member was added to our domain admins as well. So the privileges have been elevated on that account. We can see security group modification settings. So in this example, this external contractor account was added to given the security right to allow logon through terminal services. And if we can assume that this user is just left the organization, for example, so we're looking at this data historically, this could indicate a premeditated attack in the future, some unusual behavior. Now, of course, what we're looking at here is after the fact. This could have already happened. So what we really want to do is identify if users are making changes outside of their usual behavior. So this kind of chain of events could be very unusual behavior, and what we're really talking about here is anomaly analysis, identifying when users are making changes outside of their learned behavior or their previous behavior. So we have the ability to do that within this solution as well. So essentially what Lepide Auditor can do as a data security platform is analyze users' behavior over a predefined learning period. And this can be any length of time. Obviously, the longer amount of time we give the solution to learn a user's behavior, the more accurate it's going to become. But once it's learned the user's behavior, what it will do is it will automatically identify if any anomalous behavior has happened. So in this example, we can see user modifications, we can see security group membership changes, and we'll also automatically alert you on these changes as well. Here's an example of one of the alerts. We can see that this user has added a member to a security group. It gives us the specific date and time. It gives us the workstation that they've done it from. And it actually tells us the reason that this is an anomaly. So it's never seen this user make this type of change before. And it could be because it's a specific security group. It could be because it's a specific point in time. It could be because it's from a specific location. What this alert is helping you to understand is that there's been an anomaly. You would then go into Lepide Auditor to understand what that anomaly was, and then you could act on it accordingly based upon the information that you would get from within Lepide Auditor. And then the final piece is really understanding a little bit more about specific security states. This is the final piece really in that 4-pillar section that we were talking about. So for example, understanding I mentioned open shares earlier. We've got reports in here to help you identify all open shares across your network. We may be talking about inactive users within our Active Directory as well. So essentially a bunch of enabled user accounts that are no longer authenticating to the network. Do they really need to be enabled anymore? We've got a bunch of accounts in this demo lab that you can see here where some of them have never actually logged on, or some of them have been inactive, in this case for 417 days. We really want to look at managing those accounts, disabling them, rotating the passwords and kind of securing those accounts in order to make sure that the accounts do not become compromised. Or maybe if we go back to the permissions and privileges section, understanding users that have got administrative privileges within our organization. So with this report that we're looking at here, we can see all the users that have got effective admin privileges, but more importantly, where they're getting those privileges from. So whether they're direct members of these admin groups or whether they're getting the effective privilege through an indirect security group too. So I think going back to the slides now, I think that should give you a relatively good overview and a kind of a strong starting point of the fundamentals of a DCAP strategy with both Sherpa, Altitude and Lepide Auditor as two data security platforms or data-centric security platforms that fall within a data-centric audit and protection strategy. So yeah, hopefully that demonstration came across well.
Oh, it was brilliant, Danny. Thanks so much for providing that context for us. I did notice as you were going through the demonstration of Auditor, Danny, we did have a question that came up from Dario, and Dario said, does the system work on cloud-based file shares like Dropbox, G Drive, and others? I wasn't sure if that was relative to Sherpa's Altitude or Lepide Auditor. I'll answer for us, and then I'll kick it over for you, Danny. So from an Altitude point of view, we do currently offer support for Google Drive if it's part of the G Suite business network. We don't have personal Google Drive support, but we do have it for business Google Drive accounts and Gmail accounts. We're working at the moment on adding that support for some of the other content repositories like Box and Dropbox. And Danny, I don't know if that's relevant for Lepide or not.
Yeah, so we're kind of in a transition period at the moment. So with regards to permissions analysis, we've currently the kind of the first piece we start seeing who's got access to what. We currently have that for on-premise Windows file servers, NetApp filers. We can also do permissions analysis around Exchange and Exchange Online. We do have auditing capabilities for Dropbox, G Drive, and other cloud platforms as well. We've got an extensive list on our website where we can actually show you how users are interacting with the data, so that kind of, you know, who's copying what, moving what, modifying files, that kind of information. So user interaction auditing we can provide at the moment. With regards to permissions analysis, we're extending that through our extensive roadmap, so that certainly will be coming soon. So essentially all of the functionality that you saw with regards to Windows file servers, permissions analysis will be available for, there'll be a stronger offering for that in the not too distant future. We're only talking within a year or so around the other cloud platforms that we currently support. So it's on its way.
So in terms of next steps, folks, if you are interested in anything you saw today, I know certainly from a Sherpa Altitude point of view, there are a couple of things that you could do from a next step point of view. We would be happy to set up a WebEx session to take you through a more personalized demonstration where we could focus in greater detail on how the software might work for you and answer your specific questions. We also do regular proof of concept tests where we could come in and install the software, help you do a data analysis to identify sensitive content, find out if you really do have issues in the environment that you need to address, and so forth. And Danny, I believe you've got some forward steps as well.
Yeah, sure. So we also offer a one-to-one demonstration if what you've seen today looks interesting to you. What we help a lot of organizations with is we run a risk assessment too. So this is essentially helping you to understand potential areas of risk. So by utilizing those 4 pillars, we'll look at the current state of your infrastructure, which obviously starts with the data first. We'll identify things such as open shares, as we looked at, or inactive users. We'll look at numbers of changes over a kind of a trial period, and essentially we'll build you a personalized risk assessment for your organization as a kind of a proof of concept, utilizing the Lepide Auditor as a data security platform. So you can also request that risk assessment directly from our website as well.
Oh, perfect. Danny, we got another question, a follow-up actually from Dario again, asking if there's a roadmap to work on database content. And I know from an Altitude point of view, we do have an OLADB connector agent architecture in R&D right now. It's due to be out with our next release, which will probably be late this year. I'm looking at probably a November kind of a time frame. So that will support any ODBC connected database, typically SQL Server, Oracle, things like that. So that's coming soon from an Altitude point of view.
Okay, cool. And then from Lepide perspective, we do actually have auditing around configuration changes made within SQL configurations. We don't actually have any database content auditing as such today. We are predominantly, to be quite frank, we are predominantly focused on unstructured data from our offerings. So in the immediate roadmap, there isn't actually anything we're going to be doing with regards to structured data. Our priority is predominantly around unstructured data at the moment.
Great, thanks, Danny. Steph, I'm not sure if I'm seeing all the questions. Did you see anything else come in that perhaps Danny and I missed?
Yes, I have a few that are tabled here. So the first one, and Rick, I'll let you start, and then Danny, over to you. Do you both offer user training and support for your products?
Yeah, from an Altitude point of view, we do have, with the subscription of the platform, there's customer support built into your subscription level, and part of that does include both implementation and training for our customers.
Yeah, it's exactly the same here. So we offer our licensing on perpetual or subscription models. Both include support. We provide full training at the point of installation while we're installing it, and also post implementation training as well, to make sure that you're utilizing the solution to get the most from it to solve the problems that you're trying to solve. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Rick, how much IT involvement is needed to get Altitude up and running?
Principally, our lift on the IT people involved with the deployment are around permissions and access rights and service accounts. So because Altitude is agent-based, those have to be installed as Windows services. Those services have to be permissioned accordingly. On a workstation, that's usually typically fairly easy. We can run under a local system, but most of the time on an application server, they need a service account created. And of course, you've got to have access to whatever data repositories you want Altitude to scan, your mailbox environment, network file share, SharePoint, and so forth.
Okay, thank you. This question just came in. What's the difference with file analysis versus data inventory? So I'll let Rick take that one.
Yeah, Danny might have some thoughts too. So they're really closely related. I would say file analysis from our point of view is more of finding out what content is inside the file, as opposed to data inventory, which is just identifying where files are located.
Yeah, I mean, I second that as well. I think that exactly that. So we're using Sherpa Altitude to essentially identify where that most critical content is, and really, as it would stipulate, really analysing the content of the files and why you deem those files to be sensitive. So we're not talking about blanket classifying something as confidential just because it is. We're talking about automatically classifying it as confidential based upon the content that's actually in the file. And I think, as Rick kind of rightly mentioned, we're not just I mean, we do have a way of, well, I know that Sherpa obviously have a way of discovering data and kind of running an inventory on that data and kind of putting it into sections and kind of breaking it all up. But that, I guess that's probably for a different webinar.
Right. Maybe part 2 of the series, Dan.
Maybe part two, yeah.
Danny, questioner about Lepide Auditor. Is it on-prem?
Yes, it is. So we do have two options today as to how you can get hold of the Lepide Auditor and start trialing it. You can download the solution directly from our website, and you need access to a SQL instance. It does work with SQL Express as well for trial purposes. So you could do that. We also have a virtual appliance that comes bundled with SQL, Lepide Auditor, and all the prerequisites that you can download and get up and running with it. And it takes a few minutes to bring that instance up as well. So it's very straightforward. We are going to be moving towards a SaaS offering next year, in addition to the on-prem solution.
Okay, thank you. Rick, question here about the Altitude modules. Can you buy them as individuals, or do you need to buy all the modules together?
No, our principal reason for creating modules was so that customers could buy what they needed for their particular use case. So absolutely, everything is sold a la carte, as it were.
Okay, I think that's all the questions here. So if you have any other questions, go ahead and type those in. Otherwise, we will be sending around an email with the recording and the handouts. Also, in the GoToWebinar, there are handouts included of the slides in that DCAP kind of outline there. So Rick, Danny, thank you very much for the presentation today, and thank everyone for joining us.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks everyone for your for joining in the polls and that. It's been really, really interactive session. Really enjoyed it. Thanks.
And we look forward to hearing from some of you in the future. Thanks.